Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless Official 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The turmoil that rocked Genoa City reached a breaking point the moment Jill Abbott and Billy Abbott discovered the shocking truth behind Colin Atkinson's will, a truth that no one had anticipated but which was bound to explode in dramatic fashion once the trail of lies, deceit, and family betrayal finally unraveled before their eyes, and it all began with Cain Ashby's desperate attempt to cling to a fortune that was never meant for him, a maneuver so audacious and so reckless that it not only destroyed whatever fragile redemption he had been building over the past few years but also reopened wounds for Jill, who has always felt the weight of Colin's misdeeds on her shoulders, and Billy, who cannot stomach watching his mother be manipulated yet again by a man whose name has always been synonymous with scams, cons, and heartbreak. Jill, already mourning the complicated loss of Colin, had clung to the possibility that his will might finally leave some semblance of order and resolution after a lifetime of chaos, yet instead of peace, she discovered that the document which had arrived in Genoa City was not only fraudulent but traced directly back to Cain himself, who had secretly orchestrated a forgery so elaborate that it temporarily fooled even the attorneys and family members tasked with executing Colin's estate, though his carefully constructed web began unraveling the moment inconsistencies surfaced, raising suspicions that would soon engulf him in a storm from which there may be no escape. The revelation that Cain had knowingly and deliberately tampered with Colin's last testament cut Jill to the core, because not only had she tried to defend Cain in the past against accusations of being too much like his father, but she had also extended him second chances, even when those around her warned that Cain carried with him the same tainted bloodline of scheming that made Colin infamous. Now, staring at the irrefutable evidence of his betrayal, Jill's fury burned hotter than ever, and Billy's rage mirrored her own, because Billy, never one to mince words or hold back when he feels his family is under attack, immediately went on the warpath, unleashing his anger at Cain in a way that left no doubt about how unforgivable this latest transgression truly was. The fallout from Cain's exposure spread quickly, reaching every corner of the Abbott and Chancellor families, because the forgery didn't simply represent stolen money or assets, it symbolized yet another chapter of lies that reignited painful history, and while Cain might have convinced himself that his actions were motivated by a twisted sense of responsibility to secure his children's futures, no justification could erase the truth that he had crossed a line from which he may never be able to return, as the will itself contained provisions that should have benefited others in ways that were not only financial but deeply personal, including legacies tied to Colin's convoluted history with Jill, as well as charitable clauses that Colin had apparently inserted in a final attempt to balance his lifetime of sins with at least a gesture of good. Yet, because Cain falsified the document, those legacies were put at risk, the charities potentially robbed of resources, and Jill's own sense of closure ripped away in a way that reopened all the scars left by decades of betrayal. When Billy confronted Cain, the confrontation was nothing short of explosive, with Billy accusing him of being a carbon copy of Colin, words that landed like a physical blow to Cain, because no matter how much he has tried to prove otherwise, that shadow has always loomed over him, and now, in this moment of disgrace, he couldn't deny that the shadow had consumed him fully. Jill, meanwhile, seethed with a venomous fury that only a woman who has been played one too many times can possess, her words slicing through Cain's weak excuses as she declared that not only had he lost her trust forever, but he had also lost any hope of ever being considered family again, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and heartbreak that left everyone in the room stunned. The ripple effects of Cain's crime spread further when Devon Hamilton, who has his own history of being deceived by Cain, particularly during the inheritance scandal that nearly destroyed their relationship years ago, stepped forward to demand justice, arguing that Cain had shown a pattern of behavior that proved he was incapable of change, and this time, the crime had legal teeth that would not be ignored, because forgery of a will is not only immoral but criminal, and Devon vowed to ensure that Cain faced every possible consequence in court. Lily Winters, caught in the middle yet again of her ex-husband's chaos, found herself torn between the lingering loyalty she feels toward Cain as the father of her children and the disgust that rose in her upon realizing he had jeopardized everything for greed. Though Lily has forgiven Cain many times before, this betrayal seemed to hit differently, perhaps because she too was blindsided, unaware that Kane had been secretly plotting behind the scenes while maintaining a facade of decency. As the news spread through Genoa City, whispers grew louder that Kane's days in town might be numbered, because unlike past scandals where some family members tried to shield him, this time he stood alone, exposed and disgraced, with Jill and Billy leading the charge against him. Jill, determined to protect the Chancellor legacy from further disgrace, began making calls to lawyers, investigators, and even government authorities to not only nullify the fraudulent will but to see Kane prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, a move that signaled just how deeply her trust had been shattered. Billy, on the other hand, wasn't content with just legal consequences. He wanted to make sure Kane was humiliated in every possible way, vowing that everyone in Genoa City would know the truth about the kind of man Kane really was, a liar, a cheat, and a thief, no better than Colin, and certainly no better than the worst villains who had ever passed through their lives. The drama escalated even further when unexpected allies came out of the woodwork. Esther Valentine, who has stood by Jill for decades and endured countless indignities at the hands of Colin's schemes, was quick to voice her outrage and offer her support to Jill, vowing that Kane would not get away with this, while Chancellor, still navigating his own complicated role in protecting his family's name, declared that as a cop, he would not let Kane's crimes go unchecked, even if it meant burning bridges within the family. Kane, desperate and cornered, tried one last plea, insisting that he had only done what he thought was right to secure his children's inheritance and that Colin had never deserved to dictate how his fortune should be spent, but those words rang hollow in the face of the forged documents, and no amount of rationalization could erase the pain on Jill's face or the contempt in Billy's eyes. The once redeemable man who had spent years trying to prove himself as more than just Colin's son now stood stripped of all credibility, his legacy in Genoa City left in tatters, while Jill and Billy vowed to rebuild from the wreckage, not for Kane, but in spite of him, determined to restore honor to their family's name and to ensure that Colin's poisonous legacy would not be carried forward through Kane's deceit. And so, in one of the most explosive turns of recent memory, the Abbott and Chancellor families found themselves united in fury, their wrath directed squarely at Kane, who now faced not only the legal ramifications of his crime but also the permanent severing of family ties, a punishment that, in soap opera fashion, might sting even more than prison bars, leaving viewers to wonder whether Kane has any chance left at redemption or whether this latest betrayal has sealed his fate forever, proving once and for all that in Genoa City, the sins of the father do indeed live on in the son, and that betrayal, no matter how cleverly disguised, will always come to light in the end. The revelation of Kane's forgery didn't just end with a furious showdown inside Jill's mansion, it became the spark that ignited a citywide scandal, pulling nearly every major family in Genoa City into the flames, because once word spread that Colin's will had been tampered with, attorneys, bankers, and law enforcement officials swarmed into the picture, forcing Jill and Billy to relive the nightmare over and over again as each new report confirmed the ugly truth that Kane had deliberately doctored Colin's last wishes for personal gain, an act that shattered what little trust remained between him and those who had once believed he was different from his father, and for Jill, the humiliation of being duped yet again cut deeper than words could describe, especially when the media caught wind of the scandal, splashing headlines across newspapers and gossip sites that painted her as a woman forever entangled in the destructive wake of Colin Atkinson's lies. Jill, who has fought her entire life to rise above the scandalous men she's loved, now found herself being dragged through the mud again, her reputation questioned, her judgment mocked, and Billy couldn't take it. He couldn't stand seeing his mother vilified when the real villain stood right there in front of them, Kane, who had the audacity to insist that he had acted out of love for his children, words that only fueled Billy's rage further because in Billy's eyes, dragging children into a lie was not love, it was manipulation, a cycle he knew all too well from his own demons. As lawyers scrambled to verify the original drafts of Colin's estate, shocking details came to light. Colin had apparently left specific instructions that some of his wealth was to be used to settle old debts he owed, debts tied to international scams that stretched back decades, and in rewriting the will, Kane had erased those details, effectively freeing himself from obligations that might have exposed even more of Colin's dark dealings. And while Kane told himself he was protecting his children from being saddled with Colin's mess, everyone else saw it for what it was, another Atkinson scam, only this time under Kane's name. Jill, overwhelmed with fury and sorrow, turned to Devon for help, knowing that his resources, legal connections, and personal history with Kane gave him the perfect platform to ensure the man never got away with his crimes again, and Devon didn't hesitate, hiring the best attorneys to challenge the forged will in court and pledging that he would see to it that Kane's scheme was not only undone but punished severely. Meanwhile, Lily wrestled with her conscience, because while she wanted to distance herself from Kane and his actions, she couldn't help but think of their children, who were about to see their father dragged through court and possibly into prison, and she knew the scars from that would run deep. Still, Lily made it clear to Kane in a devastating confrontation that she could no longer defend him, not after this, not after everything he had already put her through, telling him that love had its limits and he had crossed them one betrayal too many, leaving Kane devastated as he realized that not even Lily, his one-time savior, would stand by him anymore. Billy, on the other hand, was relentless in his attacks, using every opportunity to remind Kane that he had destroyed any chance of redemption, going so far as to vow that if the courts didn't lock him up, Billy himself would make sure Kane never found peace in Genoa City again, threats that hung heavy in the air as Kane sat alone, cut off from every ally he once had. The Chancellor Mansion itself became a war zone of memories and accusations, with Jill storming through its halls, tearing down reminders of the past, cursing Colin's name for the umpteenth time and vowing that Kane would pay not only for the forgery but for daring to taint Catherine Chancellor's legacy by using her home as the stage for his lies. Esther stood by her side, her outrage matching Jill's, as she reminded Kane in no uncertain terms that Catherine would have been disgusted by his actions, a point that brought Jill to tears as she thought about how Catherine's memory had once again been dishonored by men with no respect for truth. The scandal spilled into the Newman-Abbott families as well, because with Jill at the center, Victor Newman and Jack Abbott both grew concerned about how the fallout might affect business deals and reputations. And each began whispering behind the scenes about how best to protect their own interests, proving once again that in Genoa City, one person's downfall always became another's opportunity. Chance, caught between his loyalty to Jill and his duty as a police officer, took the bold step of launching an official investigation, determined to prove that Kane had committed forgery, fraud, and obstruction of justice, charges that could easily land him behind bars for years, and when confronted by Kane about why he couldn't just look the other way, Chance made it clear that protecting family didn't mean covering up crimes, a statement that left Kane reeling as he realized he had no allies left, not even among the chancellors. The courtroom battle that followed was a spectacle, with lawyers dissecting Kane's every move, dragging his past into the spotlight, and reminding everyone of the inheritance scandal involving Devon, the fake twins story, and every shady move Kane had ever made, all while Jill and Billy sat in the gallery, their expressions stony, unforgiving, as they watched him unravel on the stand. Kane, usually so composed, cracked under pressure, his voice shaking as he tried to explain himself, but the more he spoke, the more his lies became apparent, until finally the judge slammed down the gavel, declaring the forged will invalid and referring Kane's case to the district attorney for possible criminal charges, a decision that left Jill with tears streaming down her face, not of sadness, but of grim satisfaction that justice was finally on its way. Still, the victory felt hollow, because nothing could erase the pain of knowing that the son-in-law she once defended had turned into the very monster she feared he would become, and Billy's fury only grew stronger, his disgust palpable as he declared that Kane had officially written himself out of their lives for good, an exile that carried more weight than any prison sentence, because in Genoa City, being cut off from family is often the harshest punishment of all. Yet, even as Kane stood disgraced, whispers circulated that perhaps this wasn't just his doing, that maybe someone else had pushed him down this path, perhaps remnants of Colin's old partners or enemies who might have manipulated him into forging the will in the first place, whispers that hinted the scandal may not yet be over, that darker forces still lurked in the shadows, waiting to strike again, and Jill, though furious at Kane, couldn't shake the feeling that Colin's ghost, whether figurative or through his old allies, was still haunting her, ensuring that peace would never come easily, no matter how many forgers, liars, or villains she banished from her life. And so, as Kane prepared to face trial, alone and broken, Jill and Billy stood united in fury, determined to protect their family's name and legacy at all costs, even as the storm around them threatened to pull everyone in Genoa City into yet another cycle of scandal, betrayal, and heartbreak that only time, and perhaps forgiveness, could ever hope to heal, though forgiveness for Cain, after this latest betrayal, seemed like the most impossible dream of all. Even after the gavel fell and the forged will was declared null and void, the aftermath continued to reverberate across Genoa City like an earthquake, shaking every family, every friendship, and every fragile alliance that Cain had once managed to salvage, because the trial may have ended with a ruling against him, but the emotional damage was only beginning, especially for Jill, who couldn't sleep at night without replaying every interaction she'd ever had with Cain, wondering how she had missed the signs of his deceit, blaming herself for extending second, third, and even fourth chances to a man who had proven himself unworthy time and time again, while Billy, fueled by righteous fury, refused to let the matter drop, spending his days digging into Cain's finances, determined to expose even more layers of corruption, certain that if Cain was desperate enough to forge a will, then there had to be other skeletons in his closet, and that conviction drove Billy to the brink of obsession as he vowed to Jill that he wouldn't rest until Cain was stripped of every last ounce of credibility he had left. Meanwhile, Cain's own world was collapsing in on him, as his children refused to look him in the eye, their trust shattered, their belief in their father as a role model obliterated in an instant, leaving Cain facing a loneliness that even he hadn't anticipated when he set his plan in motion, and though he still clung to the belief that his intentions had been noble, that he had only wanted to protect his family's future, those words sounded increasingly hollow, even to himself, as the weight of reality bore down on him. Devon, who had been one of the first to demand justice, took no satisfaction in watching Cain's downfall, because while he had every right to gloat, he instead felt a grim sadness that so much energy had been wasted on lies instead of healing, and yet he refused to back down, promising Jill that together they would make sure Cain never had the chance to swindle another soul in town. Lily, torn between compassion and disgust, chose distance, making it clear to Cain that while she would always co-parent with him, she could no longer allow herself to be entangled in the toxic cycle of lies and forgiveness, a stance that cut Cain to his core, because losing Lily's support for good was perhaps more devastating than any legal punishment he faced. Jill, never one to wallow for long, began strategizing her next move, meeting with estate attorneys to repair the damage Cain had done, while also considering how to best use Colin's real will, now restored to its rightful form, to honor Catherine's legacy and protect the Chancellor fortune from further scandal. She even began whispering about setting up a new trust in Catherine's name, a move designed not only to preserve the estate but to send a message to Cain that he would never touch another dime of their legacy again. Yet, as determined as Jill was to move forward, the past refused to let her go, because everywhere she turned, she was reminded of Colin and his schemes, and now Cain had placed himself in the same category, the pain of betrayal compounded by the fear that she might never escape the cycle of deceitful men dragging her back into scandal. Billy, picking up on his mother's turmoil, doubled down on his role as protector, vowing that Cain would face more than just courtrooms and headlines, telling anyone who would listen that Cain's exile from their family was permanent, no matter how many apologies or excuses he tried to offer, and his words carried weight, because when Billy made a promise, especially one forged in anger, there was no undoing it. Cain, desperate and cornered, began to spiral, his once polished exterior unraveling as he struggled to find work, allies, or even a sympathetic ear, and whispers began circulating around town that he was considering leaving Genoa City altogether, disappearing the way Colin once had, because the shame of facing Jill and Billy every day was too much to bear. But even in his darkest moments, Cain couldn't fully abandon the idea of redemption, telling himself that one day, somehow, he would find a way to prove to his children that he wasn't the monster everyone painted him to be, that he had made mistakes but could still rise from the ashes, though whether Genoa City, or Jill and Billy, would ever allow him that chance remained the greatest question of all. And so, as the dust settled, Jill and Billy stood united, their fury tempered by determination, their focus locked on rebuilding the damage done, while Cain drifted on the outskirts of town, a man without a home, a family, or a future, leaving viewers to wonder if this was truly the end of Cain Ashby's time in Genoa City, or merely the beginning of a new, darker chapter in his story. where redemption and ruin hung in the balance, waiting for the next twist in the saga of betrayal, family, and legacy that continues to define the lives of everyone caught in the shadow of Colin Atkinson's name.